The aftermath of the French and Indian War. The story of the American Revolution doesn't start with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. It begins much earlier, in 1763, with the end of the French and Indian War, a conflict that reshaped the world. Known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, this wasn't just a regional skirmish. It was a global showdown between two superpowers of the time, Great Britain and France. In North America, British colonists joined forces with British regular troops to push the French out of the continent. After years of brutal fighting, Britain emerged victorious, but the win came at a staggering price. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 marked the official end of the war, and it was a game changer. Britain gained massive new territories, including Canada and all lands east of the Mississippi River. But while the map of North America now bore the British flag, the war had drained Britain's treasury, the British government was drowning in debt, and they needed a way to pay it off. Their solution? Tax the American colonies. After all, the colonists had benefited from British protection during the war, or so the reasoning went. But this decision would ignite a firestorm of resentment and rebellion in the colonies, setting the stage for the American Revolution. The Proclamation of 1763, a line in the sand. Almost as soon as the ink dried on the Treaty of Paris, tensions began to rise. The British government, eager to avoid further conflict with Native American tribes, and to maintain control over its newly acquired lands, issued the Proclamation of 1763. This decree drew a line, literally, along the Appalachian Mountains, forbidding colonists from settling west of it. On paper, it made sense. The British wanted to prevent costly wars with native tribes and to manage the expansion of their empire. But to the colonists, it felt like a slap in the face. Many colonists had fought alongside British soldiers during the French and Indian War, believing they were securing new lands for settlement. Now they were being told those lands were off limits. The proclamation was seen as a betrayal, a sign that the British government cared more about controlling its empire than about the rights and aspirations of its colonial subjects. Unsurprisingly, the proclamation was widely ignored. Colonists continued to push westward, defying British authority, but the damage was done. The Proclamation of 1763 planted the seeds of distrust and resentment, marking the beginning of a growing rift between the colonies and the Crown. This was more than just a policy dispute. It was a clash of visions. The colonists saw themselves as British citizens with the right to expand and prosper, while the British government viewed the colonies as resources to be managed and taxed. This fundamental disconnect would only grow in the years to come, fueled by a series of controversial laws and taxes that pushed the colonies closer to revolution. The stage was set, and the players were in position. The American Revolution was no longer a question of if, it was a question of when. The Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, the spark of rebellion. By 1764, the British government was desperate to fill its empty coffers after the costly French and Indian War. Their solution, the Sugar Act. This law imposed taxes on sugar, wine, coffee, and other goods imported into the colonies. But it wasn't just about the money. The Sugar Act also cracked down on smuggling, giving British officials sweeping powers to enforce the law. For colonists, this was a double insult. Not only were they being taxed without their consent, but their livelihoods were being threatened by harsh new regulations. The colonists' frustration boiled over into a powerful slogan: "No taxation without representation." They argued that since they had no voice in Parliament, these taxes were fundamentally unfair. The Sugar Act was just the beginning, though. In 1765, Parliament doubled down with the Stamp Act, a law that required colonists to purchase special stamped paper for everything from legal documents and newspapers to playing cards and pamphlets. This was the first direct tax imposed on the colonies, and it hit everyone, merchants, lawyers, printers, and ordinary citizens alike. The reaction was swift and fierce. Colonial assemblies passed fiery resolutions condemning the act. Groups like the Sons of Liberty emerged, organizing protests, boycotts, and acts of defiance. In Boston, the anger turned violent. Mobs stormed the homes of British officials, burning effigies and destroying property. The office of the stamp distributor was ransacked, and by the end of 1765, the Stamp Act was dead in the water, unenforceable in the face of such widespread resistance. The colonists had won their first victory, but the battle was far from over. The Townshend Acts. Tensions reach a boiling point. If the British government thought the colonists would back down, they were sorely mistaken. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, a new set of taxes on imported goods like glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Once again, the colonists cried foul, arguing that these taxes violated their rights as British subjects. The British response? Send in the troops. The arrival of British soldiers in Boston in 1768 was a turning point. To the colonists, these redcoats weren't protectors. They were occupiers. The presence of armed soldiers patrolling their streets was a constant reminder of British authority and a threat to their autonomy. Tensions simmered, and clashes between soldiers and civilians became increasingly common. The situation grew even more volatile when the British warship HMS Romney sailed into Boston Harbor. The crew began impressing local sailors, essentially kidnapping them and forcing them into service on British ships. This practice, known as impressment, sparked riots and deepened the colonists' resentment. By this point, the relationship between Britain and its American colonies was teetering on the edge. Each new tax, each new law, and each new show of force only widened the divide. The colonists were no longer just protesting taxes. They were questioning the very nature of their relationship with Britain. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, and it wouldn't be long before the simmering tensions erupted into open conflict. The Boston Massacre, a night that changed everything. On the cold, snowy evening of March 5, 1770, tensions in Boston exploded into violence. What began as a confrontation between a handful of colonists and a British sentry outside the customs house quickly spiraled out of control. A crowd gathered, hurling insults, snowballs, and debris at the soldiers. As the chaos grew, more British troops arrived to reinforce the sentry. In the heat of the moment, the soldiers opened fire, killing 5 colonists and wounding several others. Among the dead was Crispus Attucks, a mixed-race dock worker who would later be remembered as the first casualty of the American Revolution. The event, which became known as the Boston Massacre, sent shockwaves through the colonies. Paul Revere, a silversmith and patriot, created a now famous engraving of the massacre that depicted the British soldiers as ruthless killers firing into an unarmed crowd. While the image was heavily propagandized, it struck a chord with colonists and became a powerful tool for rallying anti-British sentiment. The massacre was no longer just a tragic incident. It was a symbol of British oppression and a call to action. The soldiers involved were put on trial, and their defense was handled by none other than John Adams, a rising star in the colonial legal world and a future U.S. president. Adams, a staunch believer in the rule of law, argued that the soldiers had acted in self-defense amidst a hostile mob. His defense was successful, and the soldiers were acquitted, but while the trial provided a measure of justice, it couldn't undo the damage. The Boston Massacre had already become a rallying cry for the colonists, a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked British power. The calm before the storm, a fragile peace. In the wake of the Boston Massacre, the British government took a step back. Hoping to ease tensions, they repealed most of the Townshend Acts in 1770, leaving only the tax on tea as a symbolic assertion of their authority. For a brief moment it seemed like the crisis might pass. Trade resumed and the streets of Boston grew quieter. But beneath the surface, the underlying issues remained unresolved. The colonists continued to chafe under British rule, demanding greater autonomy and the right to govern themselves. Meanwhile, the British government clung to its belief that the colonies existed to serve the interests of the empire. This fundamental disconnect made conflict inevitable. The repeal of the Townshend Acts wasn't a resolution. It was a pause, a temporary lull in the storm. During this period, groups like the Sons of Liberty and committees of correspondence kept the spirit of resistance alive. They organized, communicated, and prepared for the battles they knew were coming. The calm wouldn't last long. In just a few years, a new crisis over tea would reignite the flames of rebellion, pushing the colonies closer to the brink of revolution. The stage was set, and the players were ready. The American Revolution was no longer a distant possibility. It was an unstoppable force on the horizon. The calm that wasn't a deceptive peace. After the Boston Massacre in 1770, the colonies entered a period that seemed on the surface like a return to normalcy. The British government, hoping to quell the unrest, repealed most of the Townshend Acts, leaving only the tax on tea as a symbolic reminder of their authority. Trade resumed, and the streets of Boston grew quieter. But this calm was an illusion. Beneath the surface, the embers of rebellion continued to smolder. The colonists had tasted resistance, and the idea of challenging British authority had taken root in their hearts and minds. During this time, the resistance movement didn't fade. It evolved. Groups like the Sons of Liberty and the committees of correspondence became more organized and strategic. The Sons of Liberty, known for their bold protests and acts of defiance, worked to keep the spirit of rebellion alive. Meanwhile, the committees of correspondence, led by visionaries like Samuel Adams, served as a communication network linking the colonies. These committees shared news, coordinated responses to British policies, and fostered a sense of unity among the colonies. Samuel Adams, with his fiery speeches and persuasive writings, became the voice of the resistance, ensuring that the flame of revolution never went out. This period of relative quiet wasn't a sign of submission. It was the calm before the storm. The colonists were biding their time, building networks, and preparing for the battles they knew were coming. The British, however, seemed oblivious to the growing resolve of their colonial subjects. They underestimated the depth of the colonists' commitment to their rights and freedoms, a mistake that would soon prove costly. The Gaspee Affair, a bold act of defiance. In 1772, the fragile peace was shattered by an audacious act of rebellion off the coast of Rhode Island. The HMS Gaspee, a British customs schooner, had become infamous for its aggressive enforcement of trade regulations. The ship's crew routinely harassed colonial merchants, boarding their vessels and seizing goods under the flimsiest of pretexts. To the colonists, the Gaspee was a symbol of British overreach and tyranny. On June 9, 1772, the Gaspee ran aground while pursuing a suspected smuggler. Seeing an opportunity, a group of colonists led by John Brown, a prominent local merchant, took matters into their own hands. That night they rowed out to the stranded ship, overpowered the crew, and set the vessel ablaze. the Gaspee burned to the waterline, and its crew was left stranded on shore. The Gaspee affair sent shockwaves through the British Empire. It was one of the most brazen acts of defiance yet, and British authorities were determined to make an example of those responsible. A royal commission was established to investigate the incident, offering rewards for information and threatening to send suspects to England for trial. But despite their efforts, no one was ever convicted. The colonists closed ranks, refusing to betray their neighbors. The Gaspee affair was more than just an act of rebellion. It was a statement. The colonists were no longer willing to tolerate British oppression, and they were ready to take drastic measures to defend their rights. This incident, along with the growing organization of groups like the Sons of Liberty and Committees of Correspondence, showed that the colonies were inching closer to open conflict. The calm was over, and the storm was on the horizon. The Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party, a brewing rebellion. By 1773, the British government was facing a new crisis, this time financial. The British East India Company, once a powerhouse of global trade, was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. To save the company and protect the fortunes of its wealthy investors, Parliament passed the Tea Act. On the surface, the act seemed harmless. It allowed the East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out colonial merchants and middlemen. This made tea cheaper for colonists, but there was a catch. The Tea Act reaffirmed Britain's right to tax the colonies, as it included the hated Townshend duty on tea. To the colonists, the Tea Act wasn't just about tea, it was about principle. They saw it as a sneaky attempt to enforce taxation without representation and to establish a British monopoly over their economy. If they accepted this, what would stop Parliament from imposing more taxes and controls in the future? The Tea Act was a spark that reignited the flames of resistance. Protests erupted across the colonies. In New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, ships carrying East India Company tea were met with hostility and turned away. But in Boston, the situation escalated into one of the most iconic acts of defiance in American history. The Boston Tea Party, a night of defiance. On the cold, moonlit night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists gathered at Boston's Old South Meeting House. Frustrated by the British refusal to back down, they decided to take matters into their own hands. Disguised as Mohawk Indians to conceal their identities, they marched to Griffin's Wharf, where 3 British ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, were docked, their holds filled with tea. Over the next several hours, the colonists boarded the ships and methodically dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. The tea, worth an estimated 10,000 pounds, nearly $1.7 million in today's money, turned the harbor into a giant teapot. The event, later dubbed the Boston Tea Party, was not a random act of vandalism. It was a carefully planned protest, a bold statement against British tyranny. The Boston Tea Party sent shockwaves through the British Empire. To the colonists, it was a triumphant act of resistance, a declaration that they would not be bullied into submission. To the British, it was an outrageous act of rebellion that demanded a forceful response. The British government, furious at the destruction of valuable property, decided to crack down hard on Massachusetts, passing a series of punitive laws known as the Coercive Acts, or Intolerable Acts, in 1774. But the colonists were ready. The Boston Tea Party had galvanized them, uniting the colonies in their opposition to British rule. What began as a protest over tea had become a defining moment in the struggle for American independence. The stage was set for the next chapter in the Revolution, one that would lead to open conflict and ultimately the birth of a new nation. The Intolerable Acts, Britain's iron fist. The British government was not about to let the Boston Tea Party go unpunished. In 1774, Parliament struck back with a series of harsh measures known as the Coercive Acts, or, as the colonists called them, the Intolerable Acts. These laws were designed to crush dissent in Massachusetts and send a clear message to the other colonies. Rebellion would not be tolerated. But instead of intimidating the colonists, the Intolerable Acts ignited a firestorm of resistance that would ultimately lead to revolution. The first and most devastating of the Intolerable Acts was the Boston Port Act. This law closed Boston Harbor to all trade until the colonists repaid the East India Company for the destroyed tea. For a city that relied heavily on its port for commerce and survival, this was a death sentence. Ships laden with goods were turned away, businesses shuttered, and thousands of workers were left without jobs. The British hoped the economic stranglehold would force Boston to submit, but instead it only deepened the colonists' resolve. Next came the Massachusetts Government Act, which revoked the colony's charter and placed it under direct British control. Town meetings, a cornerstone of colonial self-governance, were severely restricted. British officials were appointed to key positions of power, effectively stripping the colonists of their ability to govern themselves. To the people of Massachusetts, this was an outright attack on their rights and freedoms, a blatant attempt to turn them into subjects of a distant, unaccountable government. The Administration of Justice Act was perhaps the most infuriating of the Intolerable Acts. It allowed British officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried in England, far from the scrutiny of colonial courts. To the colonists, this was a license for British officials to act with impunity. If a soldier or tax collector committed an offense, they could simply be whisked away to England, where they were likely to receive a slap on the wrist, or no punishment at all. This act struck at the heart of the colonists' belief in justice and fairness. The Quartering Act further inflamed tensions by requiring colonists to house and feed British soldiers in their homes. This was not just an inconvenience, it was a direct violation of their privacy and autonomy. The idea of armed soldiers living under their roofs, eating their food, and watching their every move was intolerable to the colonists. It was a constant reminder of British oppression and a symbol of their loss of freedom. Although not officially part of the Coercive Acts, the Quebec Act was passed around the same time and was seen by many colonists as equally threatening. This act extended the boundaries of Quebec into lands claimed by the colonies and granted religious freedom to French Catholics. To the predominantly Protestant colonists, this was a double blow. It threatened their territorial ambitions and raised fears of Catholic influence in the region. The Quebec Act reinforced the colonists' belief that Britain was determined to undermine their rights and interests. The colonies unite. From punishment to revolution. The Intolerable Acts were meant to isolate Massachusetts and crush the spirit of rebellion. Instead, they had the opposite effect. The colonies, which had often been divided by regional differences, now rallied together in support of Massachusetts. Supplies and messages of solidarity poured into Boston from as far away as South Carolina and Georgia. Committees of correspondence worked overtime to coordinate resistance, and the idea of a united front began to take shape. In September 1774, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. There, they pledged to support Massachusetts, organized a boycott of British goods, and began preparing for the possibility of armed conflict. The Intolerable Acts had not only failed to intimidate the colonists, They had united them in a common cause. The road to revolution was now wide open, and there was no turning back. The First Continental Congress, a turning point in colonial unity. Picture this: September 1774, Philadelphia. The air is thick with tension and determination as delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia, still on the fence, chose not to attend, gather in Carpenter's Hall. This wasn't just another meeting. It was the First Continental Congress, a historic moment where the colonies came together in a formal, unified way for the first time. Think of it as the Avengers assembling, but instead of superheroes, you've got revolutionary icons like George Washington, John Adams, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and John Jay. These were the minds and voices that would shape the future of a nation. The spark that brought them together? The intolerable acts, a series of punitive laws imposed by Britain after the Boston Tea Party. These acts were meant to punish Massachusetts and assert British control, but instead they lit a fire under the colonies. The delegates had one burning question: how do we respond? The debates were intense. On one side, fiery patriots like Patrick Henry were ready to take a stand, no matter the cost. Henry's legendary words, "Give me liberty or give me death," echoed the sentiments of many who were done bowing to British tyranny. On the other side, more cautious voices like John Dickinson urged restraint, hoping to avoid all-out war. It was a clash of ideologies, but in the end, the Congress found common ground. They adopted the Suffolk Resolves, a bold declaration that the intolerable acts were unconstitutional and must be repealed. But they didn't stop there. The Congress also created the Continental Association, a unified effort to boycott British goods and halt exports to Britain. This wasn't just a protest. It was a coordinated economic strike designed to hit Britain where it hurt, their wallet. To enforce the boycott, committees of safety were established in each colony. These weren't just paper-pushing bureaucrats. They were local leaders tasked with rallying their communities, organizing resistance, and even preparing for the possibility of armed conflict. The message was clear. The colonies were done asking nicely. Before adjourning, the delegates made one final decision. If Britain didn't back down, they'd reconvene in May 1775. Little did they know, by then, the first shots of the Revolutionary War would already have been fired at Lexington and Concord. The First Continental Congress was more than just a meeting. It was the moment the colonies began to see themselves as something greater, a united front against oppression. It set the stage for everything that followed, from the Declaration of Independence to the birth of a new nation. The colonies prepare for war, a nation on the edge. By the end of 1774, the colonies were a powder keg, and the spark of revolution was already lit. The decisions made at the First Continental Congress had sent shockwaves through the colonies, and the people were no longer just grumbling about British rule. They were actively preparing to fight back. Across towns and villages, militias began drilling in town squares, fields, and forests. Farmers, merchants, and blacksmiths traded their tools for muskets, practicing formations and honing their marksmanship. These weren't professional soldiers. They were ordinary men, fueled by a growing sense of defiance and a desire to protect their homes and freedoms. Weapons were stockpiled, hidden away in barns and cellars, as the colonies braced for the inevitable clash with the British Empire. But it wasn't just about muskets and militias. Colonial leaders were starting to think bigger, about independence. What had once been a radical idea whispered in taverns and meeting halls was now being seriously discussed. The question was no longer if the colonies could break free from Britain, but how. On the other side of the Atlantic, King George III and his government were doubling down. They saw the colonies' defiance as a rebellion that needed to be crushed, not negotiated with. General Thomas Gage, the British military governor of Massachusetts, was given a clear mission: enforce the coercive acts, known to the colonists as the Intolerable Acts, and arrest the ringleaders of the rebellion. Gage, stationed in Boston, found himself in a precarious position. The city was a hotbed of revolutionary activity, and his attempts to assert British authority only fueled the colonists' anger. Gage's orders were clear, but executing them was another matter. The colonial leaders he was supposed to arrest, men like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, were well protected by their communities. Meanwhile, the militias were growing stronger and more organized by the day. In the countryside, groups like the Minutemen, so named because they could be ready to fight at a minute's notice, were preparing for the worst. The stage was set for a confrontation. Both sides were digging in, and the tension was palpable. The British believed they could quash the rebellion with a show of force, but the colonists were no longer willing to back down. They had tasted unity at the Continental Congress, and they were ready to defend their rights, whatever the cost. As 1774 turned into 1775, the colonies were no longer just preparing for war. They were on the brink of it. The next move would come from General Gage, and it would ignite the conflict that would change the course of history. By the spring of 1775, the relationship between Great Britain and its American colonies wasn't just strained, it was shattered. The First Continental Congress had drawn a line in the sand, declaring that the colonies would no longer tolerate British tyranny. But Britain wasn't backing down. King George III and his government were determined to bring the rebellious colonists to heel, no matter the cost. It was a clash of wills, and neither side was willing to blink. At the center of this storm was General Thomas Gage, the British military governor of Massachusetts. Stationed in Boston, Gage was under direct orders from London to crush the growing insurrection. His mission was clear: strike hard, strike fast, and snuff out the rebellion before it could spread. Gage's plan was twofold. First, he aimed to seize the colonists' stockpile of arms and ammunition hidden in Concord, a quiet town about 20 miles northwest of Boston. These supplies were the lifeblood of the colonial militias, and without them, resistance would be nearly impossible. Second, Gage intended to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, two of the most outspoken and influential leaders of the rebellion. Rumors swirled that the pair were hiding in Lexington, and Gage saw their capture as a way to decapitate the movement. Gage believed that a swift, decisive strike would demoralize the colonists and quash any thoughts of further resistance. But what he didn't count on was the colonists' network of spies and their unwavering resolve. The colonists, far from being caught off guard, had their own intelligence network. Groups like the Sons of Liberty had infiltrated British ranks, and messengers like Paul Revere and William Dawes were ready to spread the alarm at a moment's notice. The British march to Concord was supposed to be a secret, but in the colonies, secrets had a way of getting out. As Gage's troops prepared to move, the tension was palpable. The colonists knew what was at stake: their freedom, their future, and their very way of life. The British, meanwhile, were confident in their superior training and firepower. But this wasn't just a battle of muskets and bayonets. It was a battle of ideals. Paul Revere's midnight ride, the warning that changed history. On the night of April 18, 1775, the quiet towns and villages of Massachusetts were about to become the epicenter of a revolution. General Thomas Gage, determined to strike a decisive blow against the colonists, dispatched around 700 British soldiers, known as the Redcoats, on a secret mission. Their orders were clear: march to Concord, seize the colonists' hidden stockpile of weapons, and arrest rebel leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were believed to be hiding in Lexington. But here's the thing about secrets in 1775. They didn't stay secret for long. The colonists had their own network of spies and informants, and they were watching the British closely. Among these patriots was Paul Revere, a silversmith by trade and a fiery member of the Sons of Liberty. Revere wasn't just a craftsman, he was a revolutionary, and on this night he would become a legend. As the Redcoats began their march, Revere and another rider, William Dawes, sprang into action. Mounting their horses, they set out on a daring mission to warn the countryside of the British advance. Revere's route took him through the dark, winding roads of Massachusetts, shouting the now famous warning, "The British are coming," though in reality, he probably would have said, "The regulars are coming," or "The Redcoats are coming," since many colonists still saw themselves as British at the time. But Revere didn't stop there. Along the way, he alerted other riders, who fanned out across the region to spread the message even further. This wasn't just one man's ride. It was a coordinated effort to mobilize an entire population. Church bells rang, drums beat, and messengers galloped through the night, rousing the Minutemen, colonial militias trained to be ready at a moment's notice. By the time the British reached Lexington at dawn on April 19, 1775, the Minutemen were waiting. Thanks to Revere's warning, the colonists were prepared to stand their ground. What followed was the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the first military engagement of the American Revolution. Revere's ride wasn't just a dramatic moment in history, it was a turning point. His courage and quick thinking ensured that the colonists weren't caught off guard. It was a testament to the power of communication, organization, and sheer determination. And while Revere's name is the one we remember, he was just one of many unsung heroes who risked everything to light the flame of revolution. The Battle of Lexington, the shot heard round the world. At the break of dawn on April 19, 1775, the quiet town of Lexington, Massachusetts, became the stage for a moment that would change history forever. As the first light crept over the horizon, about 70 Minutemen, colonial militia members, stood gathered on the town green. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers, tradesmen, and fathers, armed with muskets and a fierce determination to protect their rights and their homes. Facing them were British redcoats, around 700 strong, led by Major John Pitcairn. The British had marched through the night, their mission clear: seize colonial weapons in Concord and arrest rebel leaders. But now in Lexington, they found their path blocked by a small but resolute band of Minutemen. Pitcairn, a seasoned officer, ordered the colonists to disperse. He shouted, "Lay down your arms, you damned rebels, and disperse!" But the Minutemen, under the command of Captain John Parker, held their ground. Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War, knew the odds were against them. He famously told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." What happened next is one of history's great mysteries. A single shot rang out. No one knows who fired it. Was it a nervous militiaman? A British soldier? A misfire? To this day, the truth remains elusive, but that one shot was enough to ignite chaos. The British soldiers, perhaps thinking they were under attack, opened fire. Volleys of musket shots echoed across the green, and within minutes the air was thick with smoke and the cries of the wounded. When the smoke cleared, 8 Minutemen lay dead, and 10 more were wounded. The British, disciplined and well-trained, suffered no casualties. The skirmish was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Though the Battle of Lexington lasted only a few minutes, its impact was monumental. This was no longer just a political dispute, it was war. The blood spilled on Lexington Green marked the beginning of the American Revolution, a conflict that would rage for 8 long years and ultimately give birth to a new nation. Ralph Waldo Emerson later immortalized the moment in his poem, calling it the shot heard round the world. And indeed, the echoes of that shot reverberated far beyond Lexington. It was a declaration that the colonists would no longer submit to tyranny, no matter the cost. The road to revolution had been long and fraught with tension, but on that April morning, the point of no return had been crossed. The fight for independence had begun. The Battle of Concord, the tide, turns against the British. After the brief but bloody clash at Lexington, the British redcoats regrouped and continued their march to Concord. By now, the alarm had spread like wildfire, and the countryside was alive with activity. Hundreds of Minutemen, colonial militia members, had rallied to oppose the British. These were not just soldiers. They were ordinary men, fueled by a fierce determination to protect their homes and their freedom. When the British arrived in Concord, they began searching for the hidden stockpiles of weapons and supplies. But the colonists, anticipating the move, had already relocated most of the arms. Frustrated and empty-handed, the British soldiers set fire to a few buildings, including the town's courthouse and a blacksmith shop. The sight of smoke rising over Concord only deepened the colonists' resolve. This wasn't just a military operation anymore. It was an attack on their community. As the British prepared to return to Boston, the tide began to turn. The Minutemen, now numbering in the hundreds, launched a relentless assault on the redcoats. Using guerrilla tactics, the colonists fired from behind trees, stone walls, and buildings. They didn't fight in the traditional European style of lined-up volleys. Instead, they used the terrain to their advantage, picking off British soldiers one by one. The British, trained for open-field battles, were unprepared for this kind of warfare. Their bright red coats made them easy targets, and their heavy equipment slowed them down. The march back to Boston became a nightmare. Every mile was met with ambushes, and the road was littered with the dead and wounded. By the time the British reached the safety of Boston, they had suffered devastating losses: 73 killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. The colonists, by contrast, lost 49 men and had 39 wounded. The battles of Lexington and Concord were a stunning victory for the colonists. They had stood up to the might of the British Empire, the most powerful military force in the world, and emerged victorious. The shot heard round the world had been fired, and its echoes would reverberate far beyond Massachusetts. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a psychological one. The colonists had proven that they could fight and win against the British. The revolution was no longer a distant possibility, it was a reality. News of the battle spread quickly, galvanizing support for the cause of independence across the colonies. The road ahead would be long and bloody, but the events of April 19, 1775, marked a turning point. The American Revolution had begun, and there was no turning back. The siege of Boston, a city under siege, a revolution in motion. In the wake of the battles at Lexington and Concord, the flames of rebellion spread like wildfire. Thousands of colonial militiamen from across New England, farmers, tradesmen, and ordinary citizens, flocked to Boston, answering the call to arms. They surrounded the city, effectively trapping the British forces inside. This marked the beginning of the siege of Boston, a pivotal chapter in the American Revolution that would last for nearly a year. For the British, Boston was a stronghold. Under the command of General Thomas Gage, The redcoats were well fortified, with control of the city's harbor and access to British naval support. But despite their advantages, the British found themselves in a precarious position. They were outnumbered by the growing colonial forces and increasingly cut off from supplies. The colonists had blockaded the land routes, and the British reliance on shipments from England left them vulnerable to shortages of food, ammunition, and other essentials. On the other side, the colonial militias faced their own challenges. They were poorly equipped, many armed with little more than their own hunting rifles and whatever supplies they could scavenge. They lacked formal military training, and their ranks were filled with volunteers who had never seen battle before. But what they lacked in experience, they made up for in determination and ingenuity. These were men fighting for their homes, their families, and their freedom, and that made them a formidable force. The siege was a tense stalemate, with both sides probing for weaknesses. The British launched occasional raids into the surrounding countryside, while the colonists worked to tighten their grip on the city. One of the most significant moments came in June 1775, when the colonists fortified Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill overlooking Boston. The resulting Battle of Bunker Hill was a brutal and bloody confrontation. Though the British ultimately captured the heights, they suffered staggering losses, proving that the colonists were willing to fight tooth and nail for their cause. As the months dragged on, the siege became a test of endurance. The British, increasingly desperate, struggled to maintain morale among their troops. The colonists, meanwhile, began to organize themselves into a more cohesive fighting force. In July 1775, George Washington arrived in Cambridge to take command of the newly formed Continental Army, bringing much-needed leadership and discipline to the colonial effort. The siege of Boston finally came to an end in March 1776, when the British, realizing their position was untenable, evacuated the city by sea. It was a major victory for the colonists, not just militarily but symbolically. Boston, the cradle of the Revolution, was free. The siege was more than just a military campaign. It was a proving ground for the fledgling American cause. It showed that the colonists could stand united against the might of the British Empire, and that their fight for independence was far from hopeless. The Revolution was no longer a distant dream. It was a reality, and it was gaining momentum. The Second Continental Congress, forging a nation amidst chaos. As the siege of Boston dragged on and the colonies teetered on the edge of all-out war, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia on May 10, 1775. The atmosphere was tense, the stakes unimaginably high. The delegates, representing all 13 colonies, faced a monumental task: to organize a war effort, unite the colonies, and steer the course of a revolution that was already underway. This was no ordinary meeting. The delegates were not just politicians or thinkers. They were revolutionaries, tasked with making decisions that would shape the future of a nation. Among them were familiar faces like John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Hancock, as well as new voices ready to rise to the occasion. One of the Congress's first and most critical decisions was the appointment of George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Washington, a Virginia planter and veteran of the French and Indian War, was not just chosen for his military experience, though that was certainly a factor. He was selected for his character, his leadership skills, and his unique ability to unite the colonies. At a time when regional differences threatened to divide the fledgling nation, Washington's reputation as a man of integrity and resolve made him the ideal choice. When offered the position, Washington accepted with characteristic humility. "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with," he declared. But his actions would soon prove otherwise. Within weeks he would leave for Massachusetts to take command of the colonial forces, setting the stage for the long and arduous struggle ahead. The Congress didn't stop there. Recognizing the need for a formal military structure, they authorized the creation of the Continental Army, a unified force that would replace the patchwork of colonial militias. This was no small feat. It required funding, supplies, and a level of coordination the colonies had never before attempted. But the Congress wasn't just focused on the mechanics of war. They also sought to justify their actions to the world and to themselves. To that end, they began drafting the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, a powerful document that laid out the colonies' reasons for fighting. Penned primarily by Thomas Jefferson and John Dickinson, the Declaration struck a delicate balance. It affirmed the colonists' loyalty to the Crown, while also asserting their right to defend themselves against tyranny. "Our cause is just," it declared. "Our union is perfect." The Second Continental Congress was more than a political body. It was the beating heart of the Revolution. In those early days of the war, the delegates made decisions that would define the conflict and set the stage for the birth of a new nation. They were building an army, crafting a narrative, and laying the groundwork for independence. But perhaps their greatest achievement was simply this: they showed that the colonies could come together as one. In the face of overwhelming odds, they chose unity over division, action over hesitation, and hope over fear. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but the Second Continental Congress had taken the first crucial steps toward freedom. The Battle of Bunker Hill, a Pyrrhic victory and a turning point. On June 17, 1775, the tension that had been simmering around Boston finally boiled over. The British, determined to break the siege of Boston, set their sights on Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill, two strategic heights overlooking the city. Colonial forces, under the command of Colonel William Prescott, had fortified these positions overnight, digging in and preparing for the inevitable clash. What followed was the Battle of Bunker Hill, one of the bloodiest and most consequential engagements of the American Revolution. The British, led by General William Howe, were confident in their superiority. They had the training, the discipline, and the firepower. But what they didn't count on was the sheer determination of the colonists. As the redcoats advanced in their bright uniforms, marching in perfect formation, the colonists held their ground. Prescott famously ordered his men, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," a command born of necessity, as the colonists were desperately short on ammunition. The British launched a series of frontal assaults, charging up the steep hills under heavy fire. The colonists, many of whom were inexperienced militiamen, fought with remarkable tenacity. They unleashed volleys of musket fire, cutting down wave after wave of British soldiers. The redcoats, unaccustomed to such fierce resistance, were stunned by the carnage. But the colonists' ammunition eventually ran out. With no way to continue the fight, they were forced to retreat. The British claimed the hills, but their victory came at a staggering cost. Over 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded, including many officers. The colonists, by contrast, lost around 400 men. The Battle of Bunker Hill was a Pyrrhic victory for the British. Yes, they had taken the high ground, but the price they paid was far too high. For the colonists, the battle was a revelation. They had stood toe-to-toe with the might of the British Empire and proven that they could fight, and fight well. The battle also had a profound psychological impact. It boosted colonial morale, showing that the British were not invincible. At the same time, It hardened British resolve. King George III, upon hearing of the heavy losses, declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion and vowed to crush the uprising with even greater force. The Battle of Bunker Hill was more than just a military engagement. It was a turning point. It marked the moment when the revolution shifted from a series of skirmishes to a full-blown war. And though the British held the field that day, the colonists had won something far more valuable: the belief that they could win. Despite the fighting, many colonists still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. In July 1775, the Second Continental Congress sent the Olive Branch Petition to King George III, expressing their desire for peace and asking him to address their grievances. However, the king refused to even read the petition, and instead declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion. This rejection hardened the resolve of many colonists and pushed them closer to the idea of independence. The invasion of Canada, a bold gamble in the fight for freedom. As the siege of Boston stretched into the fall of 1775, the Continental Congress began to think bigger. The war was no longer confined to Massachusetts. It was a continent-wide struggle. One audacious strategy emerged: an invasion of Canada. The goal was twofold: to drive the British out of North America entirely, and to persuade the French-speaking Canadians to join the revolutionary cause. It was a bold plan born of both desperation and ambition. In the fall of 1775, 2 expeditions were launched, each with its own challenges and triumphs. The first, led by General Richard Montgomery, set out from Fort Ticonderoga in New York. Montgomery's forces moved swiftly, capturing key positions along the way, including Montreal in November. The fall of Montreal was a significant victory, but it was only the first step. The ultimate target was Quebec City, the heart of British power in Canada. Meanwhile, the second expedition, led by Colonel Benedict Arnold, embarked on a grueling and perilous journey through the wilderness of Maine. Arnold's march was nothing short of heroic and harrowing. His men faced freezing temperatures, treacherous terrain, and dwindling supplies. By the time they reached Quebec, they were exhausted, malnourished, and barely fit for battle. Yet, against all odds, they pressed on. In December 1775, the 2 forces joined outside Quebec City, but their unity was not enough to overcome the challenges ahead. The Americans launched a daring assault on the city during a snowstorm on December 31st, hoping to catch the British off guard. The plan was bold, but it ultimately failed. General Montgomery was killed, Arnold was wounded, and the Americans were forced to retreat. The invasion of Canada was a bold gamble, but it was also a costly one. It demonstrated the colonists' determination to take the fight to the British, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It showed their willingness to think creatively and act decisively. But it also highlighted the immense challenges of waging a large-scale war. The Americans lacked the resources, experience, and logistical support needed to sustain such an ambitious campaign. Despite its failure, the invasion had lasting implications. It strained British resources and forced them to divert troops to defend Canada. It also sent a clear message to the world. The American Revolution was not just a local rebellion, it was a fight for the future of an entire continent. The campaign also revealed the complexities of the revolutionary cause. The hope of winning over French Canadians proved overly optimistic, as most remained loyal to Britain or neutral. The invasion underscored the difficulties of uniting disparate groups under a single banner, a challenge that would persist throughout the war. In the end, the invasion of Canada was a testament to the colonists' audacity and resilience. It was a reminder that the road to independence would be paved with both triumphs and setbacks. And while the campaign did not achieve its goals, it played a crucial role in shaping the broader struggle for freedom. The evacuation of Boston. Meanwhile, in Boston, the stalemate continued. The British were trapped in the city, and the colonists lacked the artillery needed to dislodge them. That changed in early 1776, when Henry Knox, a young bookseller turned artillery officer, arrived with cannons captured from Fort Ticonderoga. Knox had transported the heavy guns over 300 miles of rugged terrain in the dead of winter, a feat that earned him the nickname the Hercules of the Revolution. With the new artillery in place, General Washington fortified Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston Harbor. The British, realizing their position was untenable, decided to evacuate the city. On March 17, 1776, British troops and Loyalist civilians boarded ships and sailed for Halifax, Nova Scotia. The siege of Boston was over, and the colonists had scored a major victory. Common Sense and the Push for Independence, the pamphlet that changed everything. While the battles of the American Revolution raged on, another kind of revolution was taking place, a revolution of ideas. In January 1776, a fiery and eloquent writer named Thomas Paine published a pamphlet that would ignite the hearts and minds of the American people. Its title was Common Sense, and its message was as bold as it was simple. America must declare independence from Britain. At a time when many colonists still saw themselves as loyal British subjects, Paine's words were nothing short of revolutionary. Written in clear, forceful language that anyone could understand, Common Sense cut through the complexities of politics and spoke directly to the common people. It wasn't just a pamphlet, it was a call to action. Paine's arguments were as compelling as they were straightforward. He rejected the very idea of monarchy, calling it absurd and unjust. Of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived, he wrote. He also dismantled the notion that a small island like Britain had the right to rule a vast and growing continent like America. There is something absurd, he argued, in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. But Paine didn't stop there. He also highlighted the economic and strategic benefits of independence. He pointed out that America's resources and potential far outstripped Britain's, and that breaking free from British control would open up new opportunities for trade and growth. The commerce by which she hath enriched herself are the necessaries of life, and will always have a market while eating is the custom of Europe, he wrote. The impact of Common Sense was immediate and explosive. It sold over 100,000 copies in just a few months, an astronomical number for the time, and its ideas spread like wildfire. It was read in taverns, discussed in town squares, and debated in homes across the colonies. Paine's words helped to shift public opinion dramatically, turning the idea of independence from a radical notion into a common cause. Common Sense was more than just a pamphlet, it was a catalyst. It gave voice to the frustrations and aspirations of the American people, and it helped to unite them behind a shared vision of freedom. By the time the Second Continental Congress convened in the summer of 1776, the ground had been prepared for one of the most daring acts in history, the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, a bold vision for a new nation. By the summer of 1776, the momentum for independence was unstoppable. The colonies were no longer pleading for their rights. They were demanding their freedom. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia stood before the Continental Congress and introduced a resolution that would change the course of history. These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The resolution sparked weeks of intense debate. Some delegates still hesitated, wary of the enormous risks of declaring independence. But the tide had turned, and the voices calling for freedom grew louder. Finally, on June 11th, the Congress appointed a committee to draft a formal Declaration of Independence. The committee included some of the most brilliant minds of the era: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. It was Thomas Jefferson, a 33-year-old delegate from Virginia, who was chosen to write the first draft. Over the next few weeks, Jefferson poured his heart and intellect into the task, crafting a document that would become one of the most famous in human history. Drawing on the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, Jefferson articulated a vision of liberty, equality, and self-government that would resonate far beyond the American colonies. The Declaration of Independence, adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4, 1776, was more than just a statement of separation from Britain. It was a bold and revolutionary manifesto. It began with a preamble that asserted the colonies' right to independence, declaring that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed and that it is the right of the people to alter or abolish any government that becomes destructive of their rights. The document then went on to list the colony's grievances against King George III, accusing him of a long train of abuses and usurpations. These grievances were not just a litany of complaints, they were a powerful indictment of tyranny and a justification for revolution. But it was the opening lines of the Declaration that would echo through the ages. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words were more than just a statement of principles. They were a promise that the new nation would be founded on the ideals of democracy, equality, and human rights. It was a radical idea at the time, and it remains a guiding light for people around the world to this day. The Declaration of Independence was not just a document. It was a declaration of hope. It announced to the world that the American colonies were no longer subjects of a distant king, but a free and independent people. It laid the foundation for a new nation, one that would strive to live up to the lofty ideals it had set for itself. And while the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, the Declaration of Independence marked the moment when the American Revolution became more than just a war. It became a fight for the soul of a nation. The British counterattack, a test of resolve. While the colonists celebrated the adoption of the Declaration of Independence in the summer of 1776, the British were far from conceding defeat. In fact, they were preparing a massive counterattack designed to crush the rebellion once and for all. By late summer, General William Howe arrived in New York Harbor with a staggering force, over 400 ships and 32,000 troops, the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever assembled. Howe's goal was clear: capture New York City, the strategic and economic heart of the colonies. Control of New York would give the British a vital base of operations and a powerful symbol of their dominance. For the Americans, losing New York would be a devastating blow, not just militarily but psychologically. George Washington, anticipating the attack, moved his Continental Army to New York and began fortifying the city. But the odds were grim. Washington's forces were outnumbered, outgunned, and poorly trained compared to the British regulars and their Hessian mercenaries, professional soldiers hired from Germany. The Continental Army was still a work in progress, a patchwork of militiamen and volunteers with little experience in large-scale warfare. The Battle of Long Island, a narrow escape. In late August 1776, Howe launched his assault on Long Island. The British troops, aided by their Hessian allies, executed a brilliant flanking maneuver that caught the Americans off guard. The fighting was fierce, and the Americans suffered heavy casualties. Outmaneuvered and overwhelmed, Washington's army was forced to retreat to Brooklyn Heights, where they found themselves trapped with their backs to the East River. It was a dire situation. The British had the Americans cornered, and a full-scale attack could have meant the end of the Continental Army. But Washington, demonstrating the calm and resourcefulness that would define his leadership, orchestrated a daring escape. Under the cover of darkness and a thick fog, the Americans evacuated their entire force across the East River to Manhattan, using every available boat, fishing vessels, rowboats, and even makeshift rafts. The Americans ferried 9,000 troops to safety. The operation was a masterpiece of strategy and logistics, carried out in near silence to avoid detection by the British. By morning, the Continental Army had vanished, leaving the British stunned and frustrated. While the retreat from Long Island was a tactical miracle, it was also a stark reminder of the challenges the Americans faced. The British Army was a well-oiled machine, disciplined and relentless. The Continental Army, by contrast, was still finding its footing. The escape saved Washington's forces from annihilation, but it also underscored the precariousness of the American cause. Yet even in the face of such adversity, there were glimmers of hope. Washington's leadership during the retreat proved that the Americans could adapt and persevere under immense pressure. The evacuation of Long Island was not just a military maneuver, it was a testament to the resilience and determination of the fledgling nation. The British may have won the battle, but the war was far from over. The Americans had survived to fight another day, and their struggle for independence would continue. The fall and early winter of 1776 were among the darkest days of the American Revolution. After the narrow escape from Long Island, George Washington and his Continental Army found themselves in a desperate fight for survival. The British, under General William Howe, were relentless, pushing the Americans out of New York City and across New Jersey. The British captured Fort Washington and Fort Lee in quick succession, seizing much-needed supplies and forcing the Americans into a chaotic retreat. The loss of these forts was a devastating blow. The Continental Army was already short on food, ammunition, and warm clothing, and the British victories only deepened the crisis. By December 1776, the situation was dire. The Continental Army was in disarray, its ranks thinning as soldiers deserted or fell ill. Morale was at an all-time low, and the revolution itself seemed on the brink of collapse. To make matters worse, many soldiers' enlistments were set to expire at the end of the year. Without a decisive victory, Washington risked losing his army entirely. A glimmer of hope in the darkness. But even in the face of such overwhelming odds, Washington refused to give up. He knew that the revolution needed a spark, something to reignite the hope and determination of his men and the American people. That spark would come in the unlikeliest of places, Trenton, New Jersey. Washington began planning a bold and audacious move. He would strike the enemy where they least expected it, using the element of surprise to deliver a much-needed victory. The British and their Hessian allies, confident in their superiority, had settled into winter quarters, believing the fighting was over until spring. They underestimated Washington's resolve and his willingness to take risks. As the year drew to a close, Washington prepared his men for what would become one of the most iconic moments of the Revolution. The stage was set for a daring crossing of the Delaware River and a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The retreat across New Jersey was a low point for the American cause, but it was also a testament to Washington's leadership. Despite the setbacks, he kept his army together, refusing to let the revolution die. His determination would soon pay off in ways no one could have predicted. The coming battle at Trenton would not only change the course of the war, but also prove that the American spirit was far from broken. The crossing of the Delaware, a bold gamble that saved the Revolution. By December 1776, the American Revolution was teetering on the edge of collapse. The Continental Army, battered and demoralized, had been driven out of New York and New Jersey. The British and their Hessian allies seemed unstoppable, and the dream of independence was fading fast. Morale was at an all-time low, and with many soldiers' enlistments set to expire at the end of the year, the revolution risked fizzling out before it had truly begun. But General George Washington was not ready to give up. He knew that the cause needed a bold, decisive move, something to reignite the fighting spirit of his men and the American people. That move would come on the night of December 25th, 1776, in the form of a daring and audacious plan, a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. On Christmas night, Washington led his army of about 2,400 men across the icy Delaware River. The conditions were brutal. Freezing temperatures, howling winds, and chunks of floating ice made the crossing a perilous endeavor. Many of the soldiers lacked proper clothing or shoes, and the river's strong current threatened to capsize their small boats. But Washington's determination was unwavering. He personally oversaw the operation, inspiring his men to press on despite the odds. The crossing took longer than expected, and by the time the army reached the New Jersey shore, they were behind schedule. But Washington pressed forward, knowing that surprise was their greatest weapon. At dawn on December 26th, Washington's army descended on Trenton. The Hessians, professional German soldiers hired by the British, were caught completely off guard. Many were still recovering from their Christmas celebrations, and the sudden attack left them disorganized and overwhelmed. The battle was swift and decisive. In less than 2 hours, the Americans had captured nearly 900 Hessian prisoners and seized much-needed supplies, including weapons, ammunition, and food. The Americans suffered only a handful of casualties, while the Hessians lost 22 killed and 83 wounded. And the victory at Trenton was more than just a military success. It was a turning point in the war. It proved that the Continental Army, despite its struggles, could stand up to the British and their allies. The victory boosted morale among the soldiers and the American people, reigniting hope that independence was still within reach. Perhaps most importantly, the win at Trenton encouraged many soldiers to re-enlist, ensuring that the army would remain intact for the coming year. Without this victory, the revolution might have collapsed before it had a chance to truly begin. The crossing of the Delaware and the Battle of Trenton have become iconic moments in American history, symbolizing the courage, determination, and resilience of the revolutionary cause. Washington's bold gamble not only saved the Continental Army, but also set the stage for the eventual triumph of the American Revolution. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, a single act of bravery and leadership could change the course of history. Fresh off the stunning victory at Trenton, General George Washington knew he couldn't rest. The momentum was on his side, and he was determined to keep the pressure on the British. On January 3, 1777, he led his army to Princeton, New Jersey, where they clashed with a British force under General Charles Cornwallis. What followed was another remarkable victory that would further solidify Washington's reputation as a brilliant commander and breathed new life into the American Revolution. After Trenton, the British had regrouped under Cornwallis, who was determined to crush Washington's army once and for all. Cornwallis marched his troops toward Trenton, confident that he could corner the Americans. But Washington, ever the strategist, had other plans. Instead of waiting to be attacked, he decided to strike first. Under the cover of darkness, Washington and his men slipped away from Trenton, leaving their campfires burning to deceive the British. They marched through the night to Princeton, where a smaller British force was stationed. The element of surprise was once again on their side. The Battle of Princeton. At Princeton, the Americans encountered a British detachment led by Colonel Charles Mawhood. The fighting was fierce, with both sides exchanging volleys of musket fire and engaging in hand-to-hand combat. At one point, the British seemed to gain the upper hand, and the American line began to waver. But Washington, demonstrating his extraordinary leadership, rallied his troops. He rode to the front lines, exposing himself to enemy fire, and shouted, "Parade with us, my brave fellows. There is but a handful of the enemy, and we will have them directly." Inspired by their commander's bravery, the Americans surged forward, driving the British from the field. The battle ended in a decisive American victory. The British suffered heavy casualties, and the Americans captured valuable supplies, including weapons and ammunition. Perhaps most importantly, the victory forced the British to abandon much of New Jersey, handing the Americans a strategic and psychological win. The battles of Trenton and Princeton are remembered as turning points in the American Revolution. They proved that the Continental Army, despite its hardships, could stand up to the might of the British Empire. They also showcased Washington's leadership and the resilience of the American spirit. These victories didn't just save the Revolution. They set the stage for the long and difficult road to independence, and they remain a testament to the power of courage, determination, and bold action in the face of overwhelming odds. After the hard-fought victories at Trenton and Princeton, the Continental Army spent the winter of 1776 to 1777 in Morristown, New Jersey. But the following winter would prove to be far more grueling and transformative. In December 1777, Washington's army encamped at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, about 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia. What followed was one of the most harrowing and pivotal chapters of the American Revolution. A winter of despair. The conditions at Valley Forge were nothing short of brutal. The soldiers, many of whom were poorly equipped to begin with, faced a relentless onslaught of cold, hunger, and disease. They lacked adequate food, clothing, and shelter, living in crude log huts that offered little protection from the freezing temperatures. Blankets were scarce, and many men wrapped themselves in rags to stave off the cold. Diseases like smallpox and typhoid fever spread rapidly through the camp, exacerbated by the cramped and unsanitary conditions. Over the course of the winter, nearly 2,000 men died from disease, malnutrition, and exposure. The suffering was unimaginable, and the morale of the army was pushed to its limits. Despite the dire circumstances, the Continental Army did not collapse. This was due in large part to the unwavering leadership of General George Washington. He shared in his men's hardships, enduring the same cold and hunger, and worked tirelessly to secure supplies and support from Congress and the states. His presence and determination inspired the soldiers to persevere, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Washington also recognized that the army needed more than just survival. It needed transformation. And that transformation came in the form of Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian military officer who arrived at Valley Forge in February 1778. Von Steuben was a seasoned soldier with a deep understanding of European military tactics. When he arrived at Valley Forge, he was appalled by the lack of discipline and organization in the Continental Army, but instead of despairing, he rolled up his sleeves and got to work. With Washington's support, von Steuben began drilling the troops, teaching them the fundamentals of marching, maneuvering, and fighting as a cohesive unit. He wrote a simplified manual of military drills, which was translated into English by Alexander Hamilton and others, and personally demonstrated each maneuver to the soldiers. His energy, humor, and no-nonsense approach won the respect of the men, and his training began to yield results. Valley Forge is remembered not just as a place of suffering, but as a symbol of the American spirit. It was here that the Continental Army, against all odds, endured and emerged stronger. It was here that the Revolution was forged in the fires of hardship and perseverance. The winter at Valley Forge was a turning point, a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope and determination can lead to triumph. And it was a testament to the leadership of George Washington, the dedication of men like von Steuben, and the unyielding courage of the soldiers who fought for freedom. The British strategy for 1777, a plan unraveled. As the Continental Army endured the brutal winter at Valley Forge, the British were busy devising a new strategy to crush the rebellion once and for all. Their plan for 1777 was ambitious: to isolate New England, the heart of the revolutionary movement, by seizing control of the Hudson River Valley. If successful, this would cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, making it easier to suppress the rebellion piece by piece. The strategy involved a two-pronged attack. General John Burgoyne, a flamboyant and confident British officer, would lead an army south from Canada, moving through Lake Champlain and the Hudson River Valley. At the same time, General William Howe would march north from New York City, linking up with Burgoyne to secure the region. But the British plan quickly began to unravel, thanks in large part to General Howe. Instead of moving north to support Burgoyne as planned, Howe decided to pursue a different objective: capturing Philadelphia, the seat of the Continental Congress. For Howe, Philadelphia was a tempting prize, a symbolic and political center that, if taken, might demoralize the rebels and bring the war to a swift end. In September 1777, Howe's forces clashed with Washington's army at the Battle of Brandywine. Despite a valiant effort by the Americans, Howe emerged victorious, and shortly afterward, he occupied Philadelphia. The Continental Congress was forced to flee, and the British celebrated the capture of the rebel capital as a major triumph. While the capture of Philadelphia was a symbolic victory for the British, it did little to advance their overall strategy. In fact, it had the opposite effect. By diverting his forces to Philadelphia, Howe left Burgoyne's army isolated and vulnerable in the north. Without the support he had been promised, Burgoyne's campaign began to falter. Meanwhile, Washington's army, though defeated at Brandywine, remained intact. The Continental Army regrouped and continued to harass the British, proving that the capture of Philadelphia was far from a knockout blow. The British strategy for 1777 was a classic example of how disunity and miscommunication can undermine even the best-laid plans. Howe's decision to prioritize Philadelphia over supporting Burgoyne not only weakened the British position, but also set the stage for one of the most significant turning points of the war, the Battle of Saratoga. While the British celebrated their occupation of Philadelphia, the Americans were preparing to strike back. And in the forests and fields of upstate New York, a different story was about to unfold, one that would change the course of the Revolution. The Saratoga Campaign, a turning point in the Revolution. While the British were preoccupied with their occupation of Philadelphia, General John Burgoyne's campaign in upstate New York was unraveling. Burgoyne's army, which had set out from Canada with high hopes, found itself bogged down by a combination of harsh terrain, logistical challenges, and relentless American resistance. Burgoyne's forces were burdened by heavy equipment and a long supply line, making their progress slow and arduous. To make matters worse, the dense forests and rugged landscape of the Hudson River Valley were ideal for guerrilla warfare. American militias and Continental Army units under General Horatio Gates harassed the British at every turn, cutting off supply routes and picking off stragglers. In September 1777, Burgoyne's army clashed with Gates' forces at the Battle of Freeman's Farm. The fighting was fierce and bloody, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Although the British technically held the field at the end of the day, it was a Pyrrhic victory. Burgoyne's army was weakened, and they were unable to break through the American lines to continue their advance. The battle also showcased the growing skill and determination of the Continental Army. Under the leadership of officers like Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan, the Americans fought with tenacity and courage, proving they could stand up to the British in open combat. A second major engagement occurred in October 1777 at Bemis Heights. This time the Americans were ready. Gates' forces, now reinforced and better positioned, launched a fierce counterattack. Benedict Arnold, though relieved of command after a dispute with Gates, played a crucial role in rallying the troops and leading a daring assault on the British lines. The battle ended in a decisive American victory. Burgoyne's army, already weakened and demoralized, was pushed to the brink of collapse. With no hope of reinforcements and his supply lines cut, Burgoyne found himself trapped and outnumbered. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne made the difficult decision to surrender. His entire army, nearly 6,000 soldiers, laid down their arms at Saratoga. It was a stunning defeat for the British and a monumental victory for the Americans. The surrender at Saratoga was a turning point in the war. It not only boosted American morale, but also had far-reaching diplomatic consequences. The victory demonstrated to the world that the Americans were capable of defeating the British, and it convinced France to formally enter the war on the side of the United States. A new hope. The Saratoga campaign marked a dramatic shift in the Revolution. It showed that the Continental Army, once seen as a ragtag group of rebels, could stand toe-to-toe with one of the most powerful militaries in the world. It also opened the door to crucial international support, which would prove vital in the years to come. For the British, Saratoga was a humiliating setback. For the Americans, it was a beacon of hope, a reminder that their fight for freedom was far from over. The American victory at Saratoga in October 1777 was more than just a military triumph. It was a diplomatic earthquake. The stunning defeat of a British army sent shockwaves across the Atlantic, and nowhere was the impact felt more strongly than in France. For years, the French had been quietly supporting the American cause, eager to weaken their longtime rival Britain. But Saratoga convinced them that the Americans had a real chance of winning, and that it was time to take a bold stand. In February 1778, France and the United States signed the Treaty of Alliance, a landmark agreement that formally recognized American independence and pledged French military and financial support. This was a monumental moment for the young nation. France, one of the most powerful countries in Europe, was now openly allied with the American rebels. The treaty brought immediate benefits to the American cause. France provided troops, ships, weapons, and financial aid, all of which were desperately needed by the Continental Army. French officers, such as the Marquis de Lafayette, also joined the fight, bringing valuable expertise and leadership. The French alliance didn't just change the war in North America, it transformed it into a global conflict. Britain, now facing a powerful European adversary, was forced to divert resources to defend its interests elsewhere. The Caribbean, a vital hub of trade and wealth, became a major battleground, as did Europe and even India. This global dimension stretched British forces thin, weakening their ability to concentrate on the war in America. The Royal Navy, once dominant, now had to contend with the French fleet, which began challenging British control of the seas. For the Americans, the French alliance was a lifeline. It provided the resources and support needed to keep the war effort alive, and it boosted morale at a critical time. The alliance also sent a powerful message to the world. The United States was a legitimate nation, worthy of recognition and support. But the alliance came with its own challenges. Coordinating with a foreign power required diplomacy and compromise, and not all Americans were comfortable relying on France. Nevertheless, the benefits far outweighed the risks, and the French alliance proved to be a decisive factor in the eventual American victory. The French alliance marked a turning point in the American Revolution. It shifted the balance of power, forcing Britain to fight a multi-front war and giving the Americans the resources they needed to keep fighting. It also demonstrated the growing international support for the American cause, paving the way for other nations to recognize the United States. The British shift to the south, a new strategy in the Revolution. Following the devastating defeat at Saratoga and the entry of France into the war, the British were forced to rethink their strategy. The war in the northern colonies had reached a stalemate, and the global conflict with France stretched their resources thin. In response, the British decided to shift their focus to the southern colonies, where they believed they could exploit stronger loyalist support and turn the tide of the war. The British plan was straightforward but ambitious. They aimed to rally loyalists, colonists who remained loyal to the Crown, to their cause, reclaim territory, and gradually weaken the rebellion from the south upward. The British believed that the southern colonies, with their large plantations and hierarchical society, were more likely to support the Crown than the rebellious northern colonies. The campaign began in December 1778, when British forces captured Savannah, Georgia. This marked the start of the Southern Campaign, a series of military operations that would dominate the latter years of the war. The British achieved several significant victories in the South. In May 1780, they captured Charleston, South Carolina, after a prolonged siege. The fall of Charleston was a crushing blow to the Americans. It was the worst defeat of the war, with over 5,000 Continental soldiers captured. The British also seized vast amounts of supplies and equipment, further weakening the American war effort. Buoyed by their success, the British pushed inland, securing key towns and recruiting loyalist militias to their cause. For a time, it seemed that the Southern strategy might work. The British controlled much of Georgia and South Carolina, and the American cause in the region appeared to be on the brink of collapse. But the Southern Campaign was not just a conventional military conflict. It was a brutal and chaotic struggle marked by guerrilla warfare and civil war. Loyalists and patriots clashed in bitter skirmishes, and the fighting often spilled over into communities, pitting neighbor against neighbor. The British, despite their early successes, struggled to maintain control over the territory they had captured. The Americans, though initially overwhelmed, began to adapt. Leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, and Thomas Sumter organized guerrilla forces that harassed the British and disrupted their supply lines. These irregular tactics kept the resistance alive and laid the groundwork for a counteroffensive. While the British enjoyed early victories in the South, their strategy ultimately faltered. The Loyalist support they had counted on was not as strong as they had hoped, and the brutal nature of the fighting alienated many Southerners. At the same time, the Americans, though battered, refused to give up. The Southern campaign would prove to be a grueling and costly chapter in the war, but it also set the stage for one of the most decisive moments of the Revolution, the Battle of Yorktown. The rise of guerrilla warfare, a new kind of war in the South. The British may have scored early victories in the South, but the Americans were far from defeated. As the war dragged on, it took on a brutal and chaotic character, with both sides resorting to guerrilla warfare. This was no longer a war of orderly battles and set-piece engagements. It was a messy, vicious struggle for survival. American commanders like Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, and Thomas Sumter became legends of the Southern campaign. Leading small mobile units, they operated in the shadows, striking British forces and supply lines before disappearing into the wilderness. Marion, in particular, used the dense swamps and forests of South Carolina to his advantage, earning his nickname and becoming a thorn in the side of the British. These irregular tactics kept the British off balance. Instead of facing a conventional army, they were forced to deal with a relentless, elusive enemy that seemed to strike at will. The British, accustomed to European-style warfare, struggled to adapt to this new kind of fight. Despite the successes of guerrilla fighters, the Continental Army suffered a devastating blow in August 1780 at the Battle of Camden in South Carolina. General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, led his forces into a disastrous confrontation with British troops under General Charles Cornwallis. The battle was a catastrophe for the Americans. Poor planning, inadequate supplies, and inexperienced troops led to a complete rout. Gates's army was shattered, and his reputation as a commander was tarnished. The defeat at Camden was a low point for the American cause, and it seemed as though the Southern campaign might collapse entirely. In the wake of the disaster at Camden, General George Washington made a crucial decision. He appointed General Nathaniel Greene, one of his most trusted and capable officers, to take command of the Southern Department. Greene was a brilliant strategist and a master of logistics, and he understood the unique challenges of the Southern campaign. Greene's leadership marked a turning point. Instead of engaging the British in head-on battles, he adopted a strategy of attrition and maneuver. He divided his forces, sending Daniel Morgan to lead one wing while he commanded the other. This forced the British to split their own forces, stretching their resources thin and creating opportunities for the Americans to strike. The tide begins to turn. Under Greene's command, the Americans began to regain the initiative. They avoided decisive battles, instead wearing down the British through a series of skirmishes and raids. Greene's strategy of strategic retreat and hit-and-run tactics frustrated Cornwallis and kept the British from consolidating their gains. The Southern campaign was far from over, but Greene's leadership gave the Americans a fighting chance. His ability to adapt to the challenges of the war in the South would prove crucial in the months to come, setting the stage for the eventual American victory. The rise of guerrilla warfare and the leadership of Nathaniel Greene transformed the Southern campaign into a war of endurance. It was a brutal, grinding conflict, but it also showcased the resilience and ingenuity of the American forces. The British, despite their early successes, found themselves bogged down in a fight they could not win. The turning point, the Battle of Kings Mountain. In October 1780, the tide of the Southern campaign began to turn with a dramatic American victory at the Battle of Kings Mountain in South Carolina. This battle was unique in that it was fought not by regular Continental Army troops, but by a force of frontier militiamen known as the Over-Mountain Men. These rugged fighters, hailing from the Appalachian region, were determined to defend their homes and their way of life. The British, under Major Patrick Ferguson, had been rallying Loyalist support in the South. Ferguson, confident in his position, issued a bold warning to the frontier settlers. If they did not abandon the Patriot cause, he would march over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay waste to their land. Instead of intimidating the settlers, Ferguson's threat galvanized them. The Over-Mountain Men, armed with rifles and a fierce determination, surrounded Ferguson's forces on King's Mountain. In a fierce and chaotic battle, they overwhelmed the Loyalists, killing Ferguson and capturing or dispersing his entire force. The victory was a major blow to British morale and marked the beginning of a shift in momentum in the South. The Battle of Cowpens, a masterstroke of strategy. Just a few months later, in January 1781, the Americans achieved another stunning victory at the Battle of Cowpens in South Carolina. This time, the hero was General Daniel Morgan, one of Nathaniel Greene's most capable and innovative subordinates. Morgan faced off against Colonel Banastre Tarleton, a ruthless and aggressive British commander known as Bloody Tarleton for his brutal tactics. Tarleton was confident of victory, but Morgan had a plan. Using a combination of deception and brilliant tactics, Morgan lured Tarleton's forces into a trap. Morgan arranged his troops in 3 lines. The first line, composed of sharpshooters, was instructed to fire a few volleys and then retreat, drawing the British forward. The second line, made up of militia, did the same. By the time the British reached the third line, a disciplined force of Continental soldiers, they were disorganized and exhausted. The Americans then launched a devastating counterattack supported by cavalry. The result was a decisive American victory. Tarleton's forces were routed, suffering heavy casualties, while the Americans captured valuable supplies and equipment. The Battle of Cowpens was a turning point in the Southern campaign, demonstrating the growing effectiveness of the Continental Army and the brilliance of its commanders. The victories at Kings Mountain and Cowpens marked a dramatic shift in the Southern campaign. The British, once confident of their dominance in the South, now found themselves on the defensive. The Americans, buoyed by these successes, began to regain the initiative. These battles also showcased the importance of local militias and innovative tactics in the American war effort. The Over-Mountain Men and Daniel Morgan's forces proved that the Americans could adapt to the challenges of the Southern campaign and outthink their opponents. The victories at Kings Mountain and Cowpens set the stage for the final act of the Revolution. The British, weakened and demoralized, would soon face an even greater challenge as the Americans, under the leadership of Nathaniel Greene and George Washington, prepared to deliver the decisive blow. The tide of the war had turned, and the dream of American independence was closer than ever to becoming a reality. After the stunning victory at Cowpens in January 1781, General Nathaniel Greene faced a new challenge. General Charles Cornwallis was determined to crush the American forces and regain the initiative in the South. Greene, ever the strategist, knew that his army was not yet strong enough to face Cornwallis head-on. Instead, he embarked on a brilliant campaign of maneuver and attrition known as the Race to the Dan River. Greene's plan was simple yet daring. He would lead Cornwallis on a grueling chase through North Carolina, stretching British supply lines and wearing down their forces. Greene's army, though outnumbered, was more mobile and better adapted to the rugged terrain. By avoiding a decisive battle, Greene bought himself time to regroup and reinforce his troops. The race was a tense and exhausting affair. Greene's forces marched hundreds of miles, crossing rivers and swamps. while Cornwallis pursued them relentlessly. In a dramatic final push, Greene's army crossed the Dan River into Virginia just ahead of the British, narrowly escaping destruction. The race to the Dan River was a masterstroke of strategy. It demonstrated Greene's brilliance as a commander and his ability to outthink his opponents. More importantly, it left Cornwallis's army exhausted, demoralized, and far from their supply base. In March 1781, Greene decided it was time to turn and fight. He chose his ground carefully, positioning his forces near Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina. The resulting battle was one of the largest and bloodiest of the Southern campaign. Greene arranged his troops in 3 lines, much as Daniel Morgan had done at Cowpens. The first 2 lines were composed of militia, while the third line was made up of seasoned Continental soldiers. The plan was to weaken the British with successive waves of resistance before delivering a decisive blow. The battle was fierce and chaotic. The British, though outnumbered, fought with their characteristic discipline and determination. After hours of brutal fighting, they managed to break through the American lines and force Greene to retreat. Technically, the British had won the day, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The British suffered heavy casualties, losing nearly a quarter of their force. Cornwallis, realizing he could not sustain such losses, made the difficult decision to abandon the Carolinas and move his army to Virginia. The Battle of Guilford Courthouse marked the beginning of the end for British hopes in the South. Though they had won the battle, they had lost the campaign. Cornwallis's army was weakened and exhausted, and the Americans were growing stronger by the day. Greene's strategy of attrition and maneuver had paid off. By avoiding decisive battles and wearing down the British, he had turned the tide of the war in the South. The stage was now set for the final act of the Revolution. By the summer of 1781, the American Revolution was reaching its climax. After years of struggle, the pieces were finally falling into place for a decisive victory. The stage for this final act was set in Yorktown, Virginia, where General Charles Cornwallis had established a base of operations. Confident in his position, Cornwallis hoped to receive reinforcements and supplies by sea, but he was about to face a perfect storm of Allied strategy and coordination. The first blow to Cornwallis's plans came from the sea. The French Navy, under the command of Admiral de Grasse, arrived in Chesapeake Bay in late August 1781. De Grasse's fleet quickly blockaded the entrance to the bay, cutting off Cornwallis' escape route and preventing British reinforcements from arriving. This naval supremacy was a game-changer, and it set the stage for the land campaign to come. Meanwhile, General George Washington and the French General Rochambeau were orchestrating a bold move of their own. Leaving a small force behind to deceive the British in New York, they marched their combined armies, American and French, south to Virginia. This was no small feat. The march covered hundreds of miles and required precise coordination. But Washington and Rochambeau pulled it off, arriving in Virginia by late September. By the end of September 1781, the Allied forces had surrounded Yorktown. Cornwallis, now trapped, could only watch as the noose tightened. The Americans and French began a relentless siege, bombarding the British positions with artillery and gradually closing in. The bombardment was devastating. Day and night, cannonballs and shells rained down on the British defenses, destroying fortifications and sapping morale. Cornwallis, realizing the hopelessness of his situation, made a desperate attempt to escape across the York River, but a storm scattered his boats, dashing any hope of retreat. On October 17, 1781, Cornwallis sent a drummer and an officer, waving a white handkerchief, to signal his surrender. 2 days later, on October 19th, the formal surrender took place. British troops marched out of Yorktown, their flags furled and their bands playing a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." It was a fitting anthem for the moment, a moment that marked the end of British hopes in America. The surrender at Yorktown was the decisive victory the Americans had been fighting for. It effectively ended major combat operations in the war and forced the British government to face the reality that the conflict could not be won. For the Americans, Yorktown was a triumph of perseverance, strategy, and alliance. It showcased the importance of French support, both on land and at sea, and demonstrated the growing strength and coordination of the Continental Army. The road to peace. In the aftermath of Yorktown, peace negotiations began in earnest. The British, weary of the costly and seemingly endless war, were finally ready to talk. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, formally ended the war and recognized the independence of the United States. The surrender of General Charles Cornwallis at Yorktown on October 19, 1781, was more than just a military victory. It was the beginning of the end for British hopes in America. While sporadic fighting continued, particularly in the South and on the western frontier, the British government recognized that the war was no longer sustainable. The defeat at Yorktown, combined with the financial strain of a global conflict and the growing involvement of France, Spain, and the Netherlands, forced Britain to the negotiating table. By 1781, Britain was fighting not just the Americans but also a coalition of European powers. France had been a key ally of the United States since 1778, providing troops, ships, and financial support. Spain and the Netherlands had also entered the conflict, further stretching British resources. The war had become a global struggle, with battles raging in the Caribbean, Europe, and even India. The cost of maintaining such a far-flung war was staggering. Britain's national debt had ballooned and public support for the conflict was waning. The defeat at Yorktown was the final straw, convincing even the most hawkish members of the British government that peace was the only option. In the months following Yorktown, both sides began preparing for peace talks. The Americans, represented by a delegation that included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, sought full independence and recognition of their sovereignty. The British, though reluctant to give up their colonies, recognized that the situation was untenable. The negotiations were complex and often contentious. The Americans had to navigate not only their demands, but also the interests of their European allies. France and Spain, for example, had their own territorial and strategic goals, which sometimes conflicted with those of the United States. After months of negotiation, the Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783. The treaty formally ended the war and recognized the independence of the United States. It also established the new nation's boundaries, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River and from Canada to Florida. For the British, the treaty marked the end of an era. They retained control of Canada but lost their most valuable colonies. For the Americans, it was the culmination of years of struggle and sacrifice, a hard-won victory that secured their place as a free and independent nation. The Treaty of Paris included several critical provisions that shaped the future of the United States. Independence. Great Britain formally recognized the sovereignty of the United States, acknowledging the new nation as free and independent. Territorial boundaries. The treaty established the boundaries of the United States, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River and from Canada to Florida. This vast territory laid the foundation for the nation's westward expansion. Fishing rights. American fishermen were granted access to the rich fishing grounds off Newfoundland, a vital economic resource for the new nation. Debts and loyalists. The treaty called for the repayment of pre-war debts owed to British creditors and recommended that Loyalists' confiscated property be restored. However, these provisions were often ignored, leading to lingering tensions between the United States and Britain. The Treaty of Paris was more than just a peace agreement. It was the birth certificate of a new nation. The United States, born out of revolution and forged in the fires of war, now faced the daunting task of building a government, uniting its people, and defining its place in the world. The treaty also had a profound impact on global history. It inspired movements for independence and self-determination around the world, proving that a group of colonies could rise up against an empire and win their freedom. The birth of a nation. The Revolution gave rise to the United States of America, a nation founded on revolutionary principles, liberty, equality, and self-government. The Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution became enduring symbols of democracy and human rights, inspiring generations of Americans and people around the world. The Revolution also established the idea that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, a radical concept at the time. This principle became the cornerstone of American democracy and a model for other nations seeking to break free from tyranny. The success of the American Revolution sent shockwaves across the globe. It proved that a group of colonies could rise up against a powerful empire and win their freedom. This inspired other revolutionary movements, including the French Revolution, 1789, which sought to overthrow the monarchy and establish a republic based on the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The Latin American Wars of Independence in the early 19th century, where leaders like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín fought to free their countries from Spanish and Portuguese rule. The American Revolution became a beacon of hope for oppressed peoples everywhere, demonstrating that change was possible and that the fight for freedom was worth the cost. The revolution challenged traditional hierarchies and sparked profound debates about equality, representation, and individual rights. While it did not immediately abolish slavery or grant equal rights to women and Native Americans, it planted the seeds for future struggles for justice and equality. The ideals of the revolution inspired abolitionists, suffragists, and civil rights activists in the centuries that followed. The Declaration of Independence's assertion that all men are created equal became a rallying cry for those fighting to expand the promise of freedom to all. The revolution also introduced significant military innovations that would influence future conflicts. The Americans demonstrated the effectiveness of guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run tactics, and the use of local knowledge to outmaneuver a larger, more traditional army. Decentralized command structures, empowering local militias and officers to make decisions on the ground. The importance of morale and public support. The revolution showed that a motivated populace and a cause worth fighting for could overcome superior numbers and resources. These lessons would resonate in later conflicts, from the Napoleonic Wars to modern insurgencies. While the American Revolution achieved independence, the hard work of building a nation was just beginning. The years following the war were marked by significant challenges as the United States struggled to create a stable and effective government. The Articles of Confederation, the first framework of government, quickly proved inadequate to address the needs of the young republic. Economic instability, interstate disputes, and the lack of a strong central government led to growing calls for reform. Adopted in 1781, the Articles of Confederation established a loose alliance of states with a weak central government. While the Articles reflected the revolutionary distrust of centralized authority, they created more problems than they solved. Economic instability. The federal government had no power to tax. leaving it unable to pay off war debts or fund essential services. Interstate disputes. States often quarreled over borders, trade, and tariffs, with no central authority to mediate. Lack of unity. The absence of a strong national government made it difficult to coordinate defense, diplomacy, and economic policy. These weaknesses came to a head in events like Shays' Rebellion, 1786 to 1787, where debt-ridden farmers in Massachusetts rose up against state authorities. The rebellion exposed the fragility of the new nation and underscored the need for a stronger federal system. In 1787, delegates from across the states gathered in Philadelphia to address these challenges. What began as an effort to revise the Articles of Confederation quickly turned into a bold experiment in nation-building. Over the course of several months, the delegates drafted the United States Constitution, a groundbreaking document that established a stronger federal government with a system of checks and balances. The Constitution created a federal system that balanced power between the national government and the states. It established 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial, each with distinct powers and responsibilities. This system was designed to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful, ensuring a balance of authority. While the Constitution was a significant improvement over the Articles of Confederation, many Americans remained wary of centralized power. To address these concerns, the first 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were added to the Constitution in 1791. These amendments guaranteed fundamental freedoms, such as freedom of speech, religion, and assembly, and protected citizens from government overreach. The Bill of Rights not only reassured skeptics, but also laid the foundation for the protection of individual liberties in the United States. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights became the cornerstone of American democracy and a model for other nations. The principles of federalism, separation of powers, and individual rights inspired constitutions around the world, from France to Latin America to post-colonial nations in the 20th century. The American Revolution was a hard-fought struggle for independence, but it came at a great cost. An estimated 25,000 Americans lost their lives during the war, including soldiers and civilians. Many more were wounded, displaced, or left impoverished by the conflict. The war also deepened divisions within American society, particularly between patriots and loyalists. Tens of thousands of loyalists, who remained loyal to the British Crown, fled the United States, resettling in Canada, Britain, and the Caribbean. The Revolution was not just a battle against an external enemy. It was also a civil war that pitted neighbor against neighbor, family against family. The scars of this division lingered long after the war ended, shaping the social and political landscape of the new nation. The legacy of the Revolution is not just confined to the past. It lives on in the ongoing struggle for freedom and justice. The ideals of the Revolution have inspired countless movements for independence, civil rights, and democracy, from the French Revolution to the abolition of slavery to the fight for women's suffrage. As we reflect on the Revolution, we are reminded of the courage and sacrifice of those who fought for independence. Their struggle was not just for themselves, but for future generations, and their legacy continues to guide us in the pursuit of a more just and equitable world. As we honor the memory of those who fought for independence, we are reminded that the work of building a free and just society is never truly finished. The spirit of the Revolution lives on in the ongoing struggle for liberty, equality, and the pursuit of happiness. As George Washington wrote in his farewell address to the nation, "The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils and joint efforts, of common dangers, sufferings, and successes. The revolution was a collective achievement, forged by the sacrifices and determination of countless individuals.